Looking at the world's capital cities, you probably have asked yourself, what is the world's capital city with the lowest population? Well, what if I told you that city actually has a population of 0? Correct. There is a little ghost town that has a population of a world territory. Introducing Plymouth, which is still technically the capital of the island territory of Montserrat. How do we wind up with a town of 0 as a capital? Well, first of all, you got to rewind history a little bit and find out how it got to that point to begin with. Because at one point, this town did have several thousand residents, had a peak population of around 4,000 right in 1995, which is when a series of volcanic eruptions began. Montserrat is a small island in the Caribbean. It is British overseas territory, and it is located as a result, is basically created by a volcano, which is a central feature of the island. It's called the Soufriere Hills volcano, and it began erupting in July of 1995. Plymouth, of course, is on the flat plain between the volcano and the coastline. Plymouth had a population of about 4,000 at this time. However, the eruptions of the Soufriere Hills volcano caused lava and ash to partially bury the town. Now, the town continued from that point through 1996. Eruptions continued, and they continued to cover the town. August 3rd of 1996 was the final evacuation of Plymouth. Of course, before the volcano erupted, it was the largest town on the island. It contained about half of all of Montserrat's population. In July of 1996, it was evacuated for the final time. Ships were brought from Great Britain to evacuate citizens to the British mainland. And the result was a capital town with a population of 0. A status that it still holds today. Now, you're wondering, okay, well, if this town has a population of 0, where is the government? Well, the southern half of the island was entirely destroyed. And so that is an exclusion zone to this date. Nobody can really go south of Plymouth on the island because it's located on the west central coast of Montserrat. Now, what happened is a town called Braides, which is on the northwest coast of the island, in relative safety from the volcano, is now the de facto capital with temporary facilities being built in 1997. So Braides, with a population of about 1,000, is the de facto capital of Montserrat. The future permanent capital is being built just north of Braides. A town called Little Bay is going to be the future capital of the territory. And I believe at this point then that would transfer the official status of capital from Plymouth to Little Bay, whenever that point happens to be. Apparently right now it'll probably be a few years in the future from this point. Now, Plymouth is not the only thing on the island that was destroyed. The eastern side of the island had an airport called Bramble Airport or Blackburn Airport. One of the later eruptions in 1997 reached the eastern coast of the island, completely enveloped the airport and destroyed it. The present airport was called Gerald's Airport, which was by the town of Gerald in the north central portion of the island. The airport is now called Osborne Airport, named after a former prime minister of the territory. And so the airport got relocated the capital got relocated, and pretty much the entire southern half of the island got relocated. Montserrat had a population of about 10,000 before the eruptions occurred. Once everything was evacuated after 1997, the population of the island fell to 1,200. So about 80% of the population had evacuated to Great Britain. And as in some other situations where volcanoes have erupted before, people have returned. The current population of Montserrat is somewhere around 5,600. But none of them live in the capital. The capital is a ghost town. Plymouth, Montserrat. The lowest population capital in the world. Population 0. Of course, many hundreds of people also perished in these eruptions. So some of the population loss obviously didn't leave the island because they were eliminated by nature. So Montserrat is slowly growing itself back. It's a population increase that is still progressing to this date. And so we have Little Bay being built on the northwest corner of the island. Nothing can be built south of Plymouth. Access to Plymouth has been restricted as it is technically in the exclusion zone. However, guided tours are possible, and an overlook north of Plymouth is publicly open pretty much on a regular basis as one of those really cataclysmic scenic overlooks. Looking down on the town, which is buried in ash and volcanic discharge that is said to be the consistency of rock. It's literally buried in rock. So you can't unbury the town because doing so would require equipment and drills that, if used incorrectly, could actually damage the underlying buildings if they miss or go too far. So the result is all of the government buildings, of course, are buried permanently. Most of the homes are buried permanently. The roads, of course, are permanently buried under this hard volcanic rock. And they're being rebuilt elsewhere on the northwest corner of the island. But of course, with every building buried under this hard volcanic rock, nobody can live there. But it is still officially the capital to this point. As I mentioned earlier, I believe once the capital buildings are opened in Little Bay on the northwest corner of the island, I believe that status will actually officially transfer to the new capital town, and Plymouth will lose its distinction as being the capital with the lowest population in the world, of course being 0. So which brings up the next question. What place will succeed Plymouth as the lowest population territory in the world? Well, I've got that answer too. That's going to be another British overseas territory, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands have a territory on the South Sandwich Island, which is called King Edward Point. It is basically a research station. Unlike Plymouth, it has never been a functional town. But King Edward Point is the designated capital because it is the only place with any permanent human activity. But it's a scientific research station. It doesn't really function as a town. But King Edward Point has a permanent population of 13. So that's going to answer that question. The lowest population capital once Plymouth loses its status sometime a few years in the future when Little Bay takes over. Little Bay will have a population of around 1,000 to 2,000 once everything is up and running, which makes it would make it one of the smaller capitals in the world, but probably just inside of the bottom 10. But King Edward Point is going to be the answer to that question in sometime in the near future. On South Sandwich and South Georgia Islands territory, British Overseas Territory again. British Overseas Territory have very small capitals, which includes that of the most isolated inhabited island in the world, which of course is Tristan da Cunha. The main island of Tristan da Cunha has a population of 280. So smaller than Little Bay, but bigger than King Edward Point. And of course, that is part of the British Overseas Territory of Ascension Island, St. Helena, and Tristan da Cunha. The population on St. Helena, which is the big island of that British Overseas Territory, is Jamestown with a population of about 700. So still smaller than Little Bay, but still bigger than either the related island of Tristan da Cunha or definitely King Edward Point. So, but Jamestown would be in the running. It's the capital of the territory, but it's not the biggest town. Jamestown being about 700 people. The largest town on St. Helena is actually kind of a quote-unquote suburb up the hill from Jamestown, which is located in a valley, what would be called basically a warmer weather fjord, in a narrow canyon. But at the top of the canyon, at the top of the hill, and the top of the island is the town of Half Tree Hollow, a population of a little under 1,000. Biggest town on the island, but not the capital. That's Jamestown. St. Helena, of course, is also famous as being the final residence of Napoleon Bonaparte. Further in on the island, further west of Half Tree Hollow, is where we find Longfellow House, the farmhouse remodeled and built specifically to imprison Napoleon. He passed away there. And it is a museum. It is actually presently owned by the French government, even though it's a British Overseas Territory. They did give sovereignty over Longwood House to the French government, as it housed Napoleon Bonaparte. So there's a little bit of a tour of some of the smallest capital cities of territories in the world. Of course, the smallest is Plymouth, Montserrat, population 0. Hope you had fun with this one. I had fun researching it. And glad to be back. Tomorrow I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview on what the next 2 episodes are going to be. Tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the worst military alliance in history. And the day after, on Thursday, I'm going to be talking about the strongest military alliance in history. So that's just a sneak preview. So tomorrow, for Wednesday, we're going to have the weakest and the worst military alliance in history. And Thursday, it's going to be the strongest military alliance in history. Some of you are not going to be surprised by either of these. Some of you might be surprised by one, or might be surprised by the other. But I think a good percentage of people, at least with 1 or 2, are not going to entirely be surprised on which one the weakest and the worst versus the strongest. So I will see you on those 2 days, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'm going to welcome myself back. I've just been very busy lately, dealing with a lot of some medical issues. Nothing critical or nothing existential threat, and also just some job stuff. So that's been it for today. Hope you had a good Tuesday. I did. You folks have a good one. Peace out, homies.